It was a sultry September afternoon at the exclusive literary club La Plume d'Or, nestled between the polished columns of Mayfair's Chandler Street. Behind its oak-paneled doors, the city's most influential writers, editors, and critics gathered under the guise of polite debate, though most came to be seen rather than heard. On this particular afternoon, a modest crowd had gathered for the long-anticipated launch of The Crimson Folio, a novel by the famously reclusive author Ambrose Venn, known for his chilling plots and uncanny grasp of human depravity. The event had all the markings of elitist charm, delicate pastries on silver trays, waiters in white gloves, and first-edition copies sealed in glass. Yet what none of them knew as they sipped champagne and traded rehearsed opinions was that one of their own would soon lie dead, and the story behind it would read like a chapter lifted directly from the very book being launched. At precisely 4:10 p.m., a scream rang through the club's lower level. A young publisher named Geraldine Marsh had gone in search of her misplaced handbag and opened the door to the club's private reading room, only to find the body of Felix Garrison, famed literary critic and an enemy of nearly everyone in the room, slumped across the chaise lounge. His throat had been slit with brutal efficiency, a crimson pool already soaking through the Persian rug. But it wasn't the scene of the murder that sent whispers skittering across the velvet walls of the club like rats through grain. It was the open book beside the corpse. A pre-release copy of The Crimson Folio lay beside Garrison's body, page 192 to be precise. In it, the fictional character C. Darrington dies in almost identical fashion, down to the very setting, the time of day, and the object beside the body, a glass of half-drunk creme de cassis. Scotland Yard arrived quickly, led by Inspector Crome, a man of sharp moustache and blunt instincts. He was competent, no doubt, but more inclined to trust fingerprints than psychology. Upon discovering that the murder mimicked a yet unpublished passage from Venn's novel, his eyes narrowed suspiciously on the author himself. After all, who else could have known the scene so well? But the club members had other ideas. Whispers rose like steam from the coffee cups. He plagiarized that murder. He wrote it as an alibi. It's a twisted publicity stunt. Ambrose Venn, a pale and bony man with watery blue eyes, stood dazed and silent, clutching his cane like it might vanish if he let go. The guest list was brief but intriguing. Elodie Warburton, a cunning editor with a reputation for ruining careers. Lionel Thane, a novelist once eviscerated by Garrison's reviews. Geraldine Marsh, ambitious and visibly shaken. And of course, the doorman who swore no one had left or entered after 3:45. All had alibis, all had motives, yet none seemed quite right. By 6 o'clock, the mood had shifted from stunned horror to speculation. And then, as the storm clouds outside thickened into a low rumble, the club's doorman straightened and opened the door for a small, neat man in a grey three-piece suit and bowler hat. He carried a cane, not for support, but for symmetry, and his mustache was so precise it looked hand-painted. "Ah," said Inspector Crome dryly. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Hercule Poirot stepped lightly into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as though preparing to examine art rather than a corpse. "When one is summoned to a murder scene involving a book that predicts the crime," he said in his calm, unhurried tone, "it is not merely a case. It is a message." He paused briefly at the threshold of the reading room, peering at the body with the quiet intensity of a man solving a jigsaw puzzle no one else realized had pieces missing. "The setting, it is too perfect, n'est-ce pas?" he murmured. "Too theatrical. One must ask not only who benefited from this death, but who wished for it to be noticed so precisely." Poirot picked up the book beside the body with his gloved hand, studying the margins. A first edition, already annotated by the victim. He had read the scene before arriving, perhaps. He closed the book carefully and turned to the room of gathered club members and onlookers, now under the scrutiny of his keen eyes. His gaze lingered momentarily on Ambrose Venn. "You say, Monsieur Venn, that you did not intend for life to imitate your art," Poirot said gently. "But I wonder, was it art at all? Or was it confession disguised as fiction?" The room fell silent. Outside, the storm finally broke. And so, with one dead, a dozen secrets circling like vultures, and a book that seemed to have predicted it all, the case of the Crimson Folio began, not with ink, but with blood. Poirot had not been in La Plume d'Or 5 minutes before he requested the guest list, a pot of chamomile tea and absolute silence from the club's management. He positioned himself near the grand fireplace in the main lounge, tapping a gloved finger against the polished armrest as he studied the names before him. 12 attendees had signed the guest book between Thorysakopoulos and 4 p.m., a contained number, each with a reason to be present for the launch of the Crimson Folio. It was, as Poirot liked to say, a crime most obligingly designed. He motioned for Inspector Crome, who approached with visible reluctance. "I must ask," Poirot said softly, "that no one leaves the premises." "Not yet. And that you grant me the courtesy of interviewing each of the attendees myself, in my own fashion. You may, of course, be present. Quietly." Crome gave a clipped nod and Poirot stood. "We must begin with the inner circle. The author, the editor, the critic's enemies, the friends who are not truly friends, the ones who smile too quickly. Yes, let us meet the cast of our little drama." The first to be interviewed was Ambrose Venn, who was seated in one of the smaller drawing rooms under a portrait of Lord Byron. Poirot entered and observed the man for several seconds before speaking. Venn had the appearance of someone born allergic to sunlight. Pale, slow-moving, and tremulous in voice, he clutched a leather-bound notebook like a holy relic. "You did not leave the room during the reading, monsieur?" Poirot asked, settling into a chair without ceremony. "Not once," Venn replied. "I was asked to read aloud a passage from chapter 6. After that, I mingled. I drank a small sherry. Then I excused myself to the washroom, alone." Poirot tilted his head. "And the book? How came it to lie beside the victim? A signed first edition. Yet you claim the official launch copies were still sealed." Venn hesitated. "That was Felix's personal copy. I gave it to him 3 weeks ago in confidence. He was meant to review it ahead of time. I never imagined." Poirot interrupted gently. "You gave a man you despised a copy of your most intimate work, knowing he was notorious for his vicious pen." "He demanded it," Venn muttered. "He threatened to publish rumors about my brother, about things that are not true." Poirot said nothing, only nodded and requested the next name. Elodie Warburton was ushered in next, wearing a violet silk scarf and a look of dry amusement. The editor-in-chief of Silver Bell Publishing, she had the sort of polished detachment that made Poirot's moustache twitch. "You and the deceased, how would you describe the relationship?" he asked without preamble. "Adversarial, with occasional lapses into civility," Elodie said, crossing one leg over the other. "Felix once called me a literary dominatrix with the soul of a tax auditor. I considered it a compliment." "You were present in the reading room?" "For a moment," she admitted. "I went in to retrieve my reading glasses around 3:55. I saw him napping, or so I thought. I did not go near him." Poirot's brow lifted. "Yet you did not mention this to Inspector Crome." She shrugged. "I did not wish to involve myself more than necessary. You must understand, I've worked with corpses before. Authors, I mean. Deadlines often beat them to the grave." Poirot allowed her a small smile, then dismissed her. The next was Lionel Thane, a novelist of modest reputation and considerable ego. He had written 4 books, all of which had been eviscerated by Garrison. Thane burst into the room with exaggerated indignation. "You're not honestly suggesting I killed him, are you? The man ruined my career, but even I draw the line at murder." Poirot regarded him coolly. "You were seen near the reading room door shortly before the body was discovered." "I was pacing," Thane muttered. "It's a habit. I was working up the nerve to ask Ambrose for a blurb for my new manuscript. Clearly, I've lost my timing." "And did you enter the room?" "No," he snapped. "I peered through the glass. He was lying still. I assumed he was dozing off, like usual. He had the attention span of a spoon." Poirot thanked him and noted the growing pile of contradictions. Everyone had seen the victim. Everyone had believed him merely sleeping. And yet no one had checked his pulse. Next came Geraldine Marsh, the youngest of the group and perhaps the most visibly shaken. She clasped a handkerchief in both hands as she answered questions with nervous precision. "I'd never seen a body before," she whispered. "At least, not like that. I just wanted to find my bag and go home. I was supposed to meet my sister." "You say you entered the room at 4:10? "Yes. I pushed the door open, saw him, and screamed. And prior to that, I was speaking with Elodie and Lionel. They were arguing quietly in the hallway. I slipped past them when I remembered I'd left my bag near the fireplace." Poirot asked one final question. "Had you read the Crimson Folio before today?" She hesitated. "Yes. Ambrose sent it to me last month. I proofread for him, but I never imagined—" Poirot dismissed her with a calm nod. By the time the interviews concluded, the club's antique clock was chiming 7. Rain struck the windows in rhythmic splashes, and the mood within La Plume d'Or had grown heavy with unease. Poirot stood before the empty fireplace, arms folded. He now had a cast of suspects, each with a motive, each claiming innocence. A famous critic lay dead in a scene pulled directly from a book that only a handful had read. And yet someone had not only known the details, but replicated them precisely. Poirot's eyes lingered once more on the copy of the Crimson Folio, now sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. It was not merely a prop, it was an invitation, and he intended to RSVP with care. By the following morning, La Plume d'Or had become less of a literary haven and more of a gilded prison. Inspector Crome had ensured the building remained sealed, with only essential staff permitted in or out. The newspapers hadn't yet picked up the full extent of the scandal, but gossip was beginning to curdle beneath the surface. A murder that mirrored an unpublished scene. A famous critic dead with a copy of the very book that forecasted his demise. It would not remain quiet for long. Poirot, however, had no interest in theatrics. He preferred silence, order, and patterns. 3 things this crime sorely lacked. After breakfasting on warm brioche and strong coffee in the club's conservatory, he returned to the crime scene, alone but for the club steward who had been instructed to stand silently in the corner. The body had been removed, but the rest remained untouched. Poirot surveyed the reading room methodically. A single armchair beside a small table, the chaise where the victim had been discovered, the faint imprint still visible on the cushion, the bottle of crème de cassis, half empty, the glass, rim-stained faintly with red, the heavy curtains drawn across, the tall windows, the faint scent of old tobacco and fresh paper. He picked up the glass with a napkin and examined it in the light. No lipstick, no residue but that of the liqueur, no obvious signs of tampering. Yet something about its position seemed unnatural. The book lay open next to the body, but the glass had been placed on the opposite side. Awkward if the man had been drinking and reading simultaneously. Poirot stepped back and imagined the scene, his eyes narrowing. "No, mon cher Garrison," he muttered. "You did not sit here and sip leisurely. Someone placed this for effect." He turned next to the book. The passage in question was chilling in its detail. The fictional Darrington had been found in a velvet chair, blood pooling beneath, a glass of cassie at his side, and an open book on his lap. A scene so precise it might have been staged. Poirot reread the page again, his gaze pausing on a line near the bottom. He died with his critic's tongue silenced, but the ink of another's guilt soaked the rug beneath him. It was melodrama, yes, but it struck Poirot as strangely self-referential, too poetic for a cold-blooded act. Unless, of course, it had been planned to mimic art by someone who believed themselves cleverer than reality. He left the room quietly, stepping back into the main lounge where Inspector Crome was reviewing preliminary background reports on the suspects. Poirot approached without invitation. "Tell me, mon ami," he said mildly, "what do we know of Felix Garrison's personal life?" Crome looked up with a sigh. Married twice, no children, wrote columns for the Times and the Bell Ringer, loved by no one, feared by many. He was scheduled to appear on the BBC next week to discuss the decline of modern fiction, ironically, using Venn's book as his central example. Poirot raised an eyebrow. He intended to destroy the book before it was published? So it seems. According to the editor, Elodie Warburton, he'd written a scathing review 2 nights before the launch, called it derivative, pretentious, and painfully autobiographical. Did she see the review? Crome shook his head. She says it was emailed to her, but the message vanished, possibly deleted by Garrison himself. No copy exists yet, Poirot murmured thoughtfully. Then we must assume that someone else read it, someone who wanted to silence his pen before the ink dried publicly. He requested again to speak with the suspects, but this time in a different order and setting. Not formal interviews, but observations. Poirot believed that when people were not being questioned, they were far more revealing. He arranged for tea to be served in the library at noon, inviting the 4 key suspects, Venn, Warburton, Thane, and Marsh, for what he called a civil discussion of literary merit. They arrived slowly, each aware of the real purpose, but playing along. Venn sat by the fire, his thin hands twitching. Elodie reclined with her, arms folded, radiating controlled tension. Thane sprawled across a velvet armchair with studied arrogance. Geraldine sat on the edge of her seat, eyes flicking nervously toward Poirot. "Let us discuss the death of a critic," Poirot began, pouring tea with deliberate precision. Felix Garrison's pen, it seems, could slice deeper than a blade, but I wonder, what is the greater crime? The cruelty of a review, or the silence it may bring in retaliation? They exchanged glances, unsure whether to answer or wait. Poirot continued, unfazed. "It is curious to me, the theatrical nature of his death, the staging, the props, the scene pulled straight from fiction. A clever killer, perhaps, or a desperate one. I suppose you're suggesting one of us is that killer?" Elodie said flatly. "Not at all," Poirot replied with a smile. "I suggest that one of you may know more than you have said, and in time that knowledge will speak louder than denials." He handed Thane a cup. "Monsieur, I'm told you were working on a new manuscript." "Indeed," Thane said with a smug nod. "A political satire. Less murder, more mayhem." "And yet no publisher has accepted it?" Thane frowned. "Not yet." "Felix Garrison, would he have reviewed it?" Thane hesitated. "Eventually, but only if I begged, which I did not." Poirot turned to Venn. "And you, monsieur? You gave the victim a private copy of your work, knowing his taste for cruelty." "Why?" "I thought he might surprise me," Venn whispered. "That perhaps he would see what I truly meant, that he would understand it. But instead, he prepared to humiliate you." "Yes. Did you confront him?" Venn did not respond. Poirot leaned back. Curious, is it not, that so many knew the precise details of that chapter, the death scene, yet no copies were officially distributed. Geraldine Marsh spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ambrose read it aloud once, in a private meeting. Just us, Elodie and Felix. He was unsure about it, wanted feedback." Elodie's eyes narrowed. "You told him to keep it in?" Geraldine nodded. "It was powerful. Everyone said so." Poirot's gaze sharpened. then there are at least 3 people here who had heard the details of that death scene in advance. 3 who could have recreated it, and 1 who ensured that Garrison would not be alive to speak about what he'd planned to publish. He stood, dusting a crumb from his sleeve. This was not a spontaneous crime. It was rehearsed, and whoever committed it believes they wrote the ending. He paused at the door. But I, mes amis, am not yet convinced we have reached the final page. Later that evening, Inspector Crome burst into the conservatory where Poirot sat in silent contemplation, polishing his cufflinks with a square of linen as though time itself were no concern of his. Crome, on the other hand, was flushed with a sense of urgency and what he clearly believed to be triumph. "We've got something," Crome declared, placing a stack of printed emails and correspondence onto the glass-topped table. Poirot did not look up immediately, but instead waited a moment, folding the cloth carefully before addressing the inspector with his usual unhurried poise. "Something, mon ami, or everything?" Crome ignored the remark and opened the top file. "We recovered deleted emails from Elodie Warburton's office system. One of them is a draft," she typed and then failed to send. A message addressed to Felix Garrison. It reads, and I quote, "If you go ahead with this smear piece, I swear I'll ruin you. You've buried better men than yourself, but you won't get away with this one." Poirot finally met his gaze. "That is inflammatory." "It's practically a confession," Crome insisted. "And it gets better. We've matched her fingerprints on the glass of cassis, the one next to the body. She claimed she never entered the room except to collect her spectacles and that she never touched anything." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And yet she left a print on the glass?" "Precisely." "And you believe this resolves the matter?" Crome crossed his arms. "She had motive. She had opportunity. She knew the scene from the reading, and now we have physical evidence." Poirot stood slowly, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel. "Ah, physical evidence. That most misleading of comforts. Like shadows in fog, it gives the impression of clarity where there is only suggestion." He motioned for Crome to follow as he returned to the lounge, where Elodie Warburton was now seated in one of the wing-back chairs, speaking quietly with a club attendant. Poirot gestured for privacy, and the attendant retreated. "Elodie," he said softly, "there are those who believe you killed Felix Garrison. They have their reasons. Your fingerprints, a draft of a hostile message, a history, perhaps, of private resentment. But I must ask you plainly, did you place the glass beside the body?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "No. I picked it up when I walked into the room and saw him lying there. I was startled. I didn't think. I set it back down immediately." "You told Inspector Crome you did not approach the body." "I didn't realize the glass counted," she replied tersely. "It was instinctive. I didn't want it to spill." Poirot nodded slowly. "And the email?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes, I wrote it, but I didn't send it. I was furious. He'd told me what he planned to write. It would have damaged Ambrose beyond repair. Felix liked to push people just far enough to see what they'd do." "Did you tell anyone about the review he planned to publish?" "No," she said. "I deleted the message because I regretted the tone. I didn't want it used against me later. I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot studied her for a moment longer and then turned to Crome. "You see, mon ami, what looks like a match of facts may be no more than the outline of coincidence." Crome, dissatisfied but silent, folded the papers and left the room. Poirot returned to the fireplace, where he once again reviewed his notes, thinking not of what had been said, but how it had been said. He turned back to the book. The victim's body had been found beside a glass he would not logically have used. The positioning was performative, and yet someone had to have known where that passage lay, page 192, which meant someone had read it in advance and planned the death accordingly. Poirot requested all available annotated copies of the Crimson Folio from Venn's publisher. By 10 p.m., he was examining 3 proof copies, each slightly different. Only one had notes in Venn's own handwriting. The others had typesetter's marks, but nothing revealing. He returned to the original copy found beside the victim. That copy had margin notes in blue ink. The club's steward entered discreetly with a note. "Miss Marsh wishes to speak with you privately, monsieur." Poirot nodded and followed him to one of the smaller sitting rooms where Geraldine stood near the window, looking down at the lamplit street. "I didn't know who else to tell," she said as he entered. "But something's wrong. There was a page missing." Poirot tilted his head. "Missing?" "Yes," she said, turning toward him. "In the book. Felix's copy. I handled it when I was proofreading. It was whole, but when I saw it again today, page 193 was gone, torn out." "And what was on page 193? She hesitated. "The aftermath of the scene. The character's death, yes, but also a clue. Something the killer dropped." Poirot moved closer. "Something incriminating?" Geraldine nodded. "Yes, a detail the character forgot to remove. A ring with a cracked stone, if I remember correctly." Poirot's eyes lit faintly. "And was this detail ever read aloud?" "I don't think so." Ambrose stopped just before that page. He thought it was too melodramatic. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. "Then whoever staged the murder stopped with what had been made public. They did not know about the ring, which means they had only partial access to the book." She looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," Poirot said gently, "that our murderer is not Elodie Warburton, despite appearances. It is someone who knew just enough to fake the scene, but not enough to finish it." He paced slowly, thinking aloud now. "The fingerprints, the email, they are red herrings. The page missing from the book tells me more. The killer feared discovery, and so removed the part that might later contradict the performance. But in doing so, they revealed the limits of their knowledge." He stopped suddenly. "And there is another matter." "What?" Poirot turned to her. "The glass of crème de cassis." "Why that?" "Drink, mademoiselle." "I don't know. It's unusual, isn't it?" "Oui. Too unusual. It was described in the book, yes. But who drinks it in real life?" "Only someone who wanted to follow the text exactly. But such precision also reveals fear, a fear of improvisation." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Tell no one of this conversation. Not yet." Back in his room, Poirot made one final note in his small leather diary. "The killer is not clever. The killer is obedient. They follow patterns, up to the point where they run out of script." He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and went to sleep. Tomorrow he would set a trap, not to catch the clever, but to catch the unimaginative. The next morning, Poirot arrived in the club's main salon precisely at 8 o'clock. The rain had lifted overnight, leaving the streets outside glassy with reflection, and a faint sunlight filtered through the tall windows. Poirot appeared refreshed, his grey suit sharp, his moustache symmetrical, and his eyes alert with intent. He requested breakfast be served to all primary guests, together at the same table. Inspector Crome raised a brow but said nothing. By now he had learned not to interfere when Poirot began to arrange his pieces, as the detective once called it. And this, unmistakably, was a setup. At precisely 8:30 a.m., Ambrose Venn, Elodie Warburton, Lionel Thane, and Geraldine Marsh were seated at a long mahogany table laid with eggs, pastries, coffee, and fruit. The tension at the table was understated but palpable. None of them had slept well, and Poirot, of course, thrived on such disquiet. He took his seat at the head of the table, unfolded his napkin with precision, and said mildly, "Forgive the early summons, mes amis, but I find that the hour before the city wakes is most revealing. One sees things clearly before the roles resume." Venn gave a thin smile. "You think one of us is playing a role, monsieur?" "Not at all," Poirot replied, buttering his toast. "I think all of you are. The question is only which performance hides guilt and which merely fear." He sipped his coffee, then turned to Thane. You are a man of fiction, monsieur. Tell me, if a character stages a murder to match a scene in a book, does that not betray a desire to shift blame? A way of saying, it was not I, it was the story. Thane gave a sharp laugh. If you're accusing me of being unimaginative, you're probably right, but I've never liked stagecraft. Too many curtains, not enough substance. Poirot nodded. Just so. And yet someone has performed here, not just killed, but dramatized. Why? To entertain, to mislead, or perhaps to punish. He turned next to Elodie. The page that was torn, did you ever read it? She shook her head. No. The final draft I saw ended with the body. Ambrose made last-minute additions, but I didn't see them. Poirot gave nothing away, but observed the slight shift in her tone. She was growing more defensive, more cautious. Then he looked at Geraldine. Mademoiselle, when you proofread the book, did you notice anything else? Something irregular? She looked nervous, and Poirot noted it. There were a few corrections, she said, but no major changes except for that final death scene. And yet, Poirot said gently, the killer followed the book precisely until the torn page, then stopped. That suggests knowledge of the scene was partial. And if so, where did they learn it? Venn stirred in his chair, his voice tight. This is all very entertaining, monsieur, but I fail to see the purpose of this breakfast. The purpose, Poirot said quietly, is to observe how the guilty act when their performance is no longer scripted. He stood, which brings us to something rather curious. He retrieved a folder from his coat and opened it. Inside was a printed image, photocopied from Felix Garrison's annotated manuscript. It showed a blue ink margin note from the critic, circled twice. Poirot laid it in front of them. This was written in the victim's hand. Note what he says. The handwriting read, overwrought. Too obvious. Would work better if the killer drank the cassis instead. Adds irony. The room fell still. Venn's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Elodie narrowed her eyes. Geraldine looked down. Thane blinked as if absorbing the implication. The critic, it seems, was not entirely convinced by the original scene, Poirot said, and proposed a change that, had it been accepted, might have given this murder a different tone entirely. But the killer did not know this note existed, and so they left the cassis untouched, merely placed beside the body. Poirot looked at each of them. So I ask, who among you would follow the original version, unaware that the victim had suggested an edit? Only someone who never saw this copy. Someone who had heard the scene once, remembered the details, and tried to recreate it without full knowledge, which excludes one person entirely. He paused. Miss Marsh. All eyes turned to Geraldine. She blinked rapidly. Me? Poirot nodded. You saw the full manuscript. You proofread the version with this note. You would have remembered it. You would not have made the error. That proves I didn't do it, she said, startled. Precisely. Poirot moved around the table, slow and deliberate, which narrows it further. Mr. Venn, you wrote the scene. You had access to every version, but would you murder a man using your own published words, knowing they would link back to you directly? Venn didn't respond. Elodie, Poirot said, stopping behind her. You read the draft, but not the annotated manuscript. So it is possible you did not know of the note. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice low. No, Poirot said, gently. But you knew what he planned to publish. You had a motive. That makes your silence suspicious. Not criminal, but protective. He turned to the last man at the table. And so we arrive, Monsieur Thane. Thane looked up slowly. I had no reason to kill him. He never reviewed my book. No, Poirot agreed. But he destroyed your past ones. Publicly. Ruthlessly. And you attended the reading. You heard the scene once. Memorized it, perhaps. but you never saw the corrected version. You believed you could recreate the scene to match the passage exactly, and that would shift suspicion to the author. That's absurd, Thane muttered. You have no proof. No, Poirot admitted. But I have a pattern. You are a writer of lesser talent, Monsieur Thane, and the scene was executed not with brilliance, but with obedience. You followed what you heard. You dared not improvise. That is your greatest weakness. Thane stood abruptly, chair scraping. This is nonsense. You're just guessing. Poirot remained calm. If I am wrong, you have nothing to fear. But if I am right, then you will find yourself trapped, not by what you did, but by what you forgot. He turned to Crome. Search his room. There will be traces. A torn page, perhaps. A scrap of notes where he rehearsed the scene. Writers rarely act without outlines. Crome nodded and left. Thane's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. And in that stillness, Poirot saw the truth settle across the room like a long-delayed revelation. Guilt, monsieur, he said softly, is not always about what you do. Sometimes it is what you forget to conceal. He stepped back from the table. I believe the killer will soon be revealed, and when they are, we must ask, was it revenge, or was it simply envy dressed as art? The table remained silent. But Poirot already knew the answer. The morning had barely progressed beyond its second hour, when a sudden disturbance shattered the brittle quiet of the literary club. It came not from within, but from the second-floor landing, near the private rooms assigned to each guest. A club attendant, pale and breathless, burst into the main hall, clutching the staircase railing with white-knuckled fingers. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector, it's Miss Marsh, her room. Poirot was already on his feet, his cane forgotten by the fireplace. He ascended the stairs at once, Crome close behind him. The door to Geraldine Marsh's guest room stood slightly ajar. Poirot pushed it open slowly. Inside, the room was in disarray. A chair had been overturned. Books were scattered across the floor. The window was open, and the early breeze flapped the sheer curtain like a limp sail. On the edge of the writing desk, a folded page sat under a paperweight. Poirot approached it at once. The handwriting was Geraldine's. I'm sorry. I should have spoken sooner. I know something that may help. Meet me in the reading room at 10. It was signed with only her initials. GM Crome glanced around. There's no sign of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. But where is she? Poirot turned to the open window and peered down. A ledge ran along the outer wall, far too narrow for escape. There was no fire escape or balcony. She hadn't climbed out. She had left willingly. But why in such haste? And why leave the note where it could be found before 10 o'clock? Poirot turned back to the room. Something else was off. The discarded books, the open travel case. None of it pointed to flight. It pointed to someone searching. Check the hallway staff, Poirot said. I want to know who entered this floor in the last half hour. Quietly. Crome nodded and stepped out. Poirot remained behind, scanning the scene again. He opened Geraldine's case. Inside were her notes, proofreading marks, typed manuscripts, and personal letters. Tucked inside one folder, however, was something unusual. A receipt from a small printer in Soho. Poirot unfolded it. It was dated 3 days before the murder. The item purchased, private copy, edit and print. Chapter 11, page 190-193. One copy. His eyes sharpened. Geraldine had printed her own version of the book's final pages, likely for personal reference or safekeeping. That meant she had the page with the ring, the detail removed from Felix Garrison's copy. And now she was gone. Poirot stepped out into the hall just as Crome returned. The maid on duty saw Geraldine leave her room at 9:15. Crome reported. She went down the back stairs, said she had a parcel to post. Poirot checked his watch. Then she is due to arrive at the reading room in less than half an hour. She intended to meet someone, but she also left the note for us. Crome frowned. Why leave a note for us and go meet the killer alone? Because, Poirot said slowly, she realized something she believed could close the case, and she didn't want us to intervene before confirming it herself. Risky. Foolish, Poirot corrected, but brave. They descended quickly. The reading room had not been touched since the initial investigation. Poirot instructed the staff to leave the room as it was, unchanged, and waited by the fireplace, eyes fixed on the door. At 10 sharp, it opened. But not Geraldine. Ambrose Venn stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, and upon seeing Poirot and Crome, he froze. "You?" Poirot said quietly. "You received her message?" Venn blinked. "What message?" Poirot stepped forward. "You're not here by accident, monsieur. You came to meet someone. Who?" "I," Venn faltered. "I was summoned. I received an anonymous message yesterday evening. It said, 'The truth will be revealed at 10 in the reading room.' I thought it was from you." Crome raised an eyebrow. No such message was sent. Poirot's expression hardened. "Then someone wanted the two of you to meet. Geraldine and you, and yet she is not here." He turned back to Crome. "Search the entire building, every room, every hallway. Discreetly. She may still be inside, but I fear she may no longer be free to leave." The next hour passed like cold molasses. Poirot remained stationed in the reading room, silently replaying every conversation, every gesture, every slip of the tongue. Outside the windows, the day had turned gray again, as if the weather itself was anxious. At 11:05, Crome returned. This time, not alone. 2 constables followed behind with solemn faces. One carried something in his hands, a small paperback book, its spine cracked and worn. "We found this near the staff storage room in the basement," Crome said, "hidden under a pile of linens." Poirot took the book and opened it. It was The Crimson Folio. Inside, a single page had been marked and folded back. Page 193. "The ring," Poirot murmured. "The one the killer left behind in the fictional scene." He turned the page over. At the bottom, written in the margin, was Geraldine's note. This one scribbled in pencil. Thane lied. This ring detail was never read aloud. He shouldn't have known about it. Poirot closed the book. Then she knew. She confronted him, and he took steps to ensure silence. "She's not in the building," Crome added grimly. None of the staff saw her return. Poirot looked again at the book in his hand. Then the killer didn't hide her. He only removed the evidence. She may still be alive, but only if he believes she can be useful. He turned to the fireplace, tapping the spine of the book against his palm. "Thane is not clever," he said again. "He is methodical, predictable. But something has shifted. He's improvising now, and that is where he will make his mistake." At noon, Poirot gathered the remaining suspects once more. This time, not in the lounge, but in the grand hall of the club, a room rarely used, but large enough for formality. Venn, Elodie, and Thane arrived within minutes, each increasingly uneasy. Thane kept darting glances toward the hallway. Poirot noticed it every time. He stood calmly at the front of the room, beside a grand piano that had not been tuned in years. He placed the recovered copy of the book on the music stand and tapped its cover. "We now possess 2 versions of the Crimson Folio," he said, "the published version and the one annotated with a crucial detail. A ring. It is this ring, Mes Amis, which was intended to lead the fictional detective to the killer. In fiction, the clue was overlooked, but in reality, it has become central." He turned to Thane directly. "The ring was not in the version read aloud. You should not have known about it." Thane stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Geraldine knew. She proofed that version, and she realized your knowledge exceeded what you should have had. That's why she left a note. That's why she summoned you. "I never met her," Thane said, voice rising. "I never spoke to her today." Poirot raised a hand. Then why did she write your name? He opened the book again and turned it so all could see. At the very end of the note, faint but legible, were the final words, LT, page 193. Only he could have known. There was a long silence. Then Thane moved. He lunged, not for Poirot, but for the book, as though destroying it could erase the chain of events now falling upon him. But Crome stepped forward swiftly, catching him by the arm and wrenching him backward. And at that precise moment, a voice echoed from the hallway. I wouldn't bother. It was Geraldine. She stepped into the hall, flanked by 2 constables. Her coat was soaked from the rain, but her expression was resolute. He tried to follow me. I got away, left the book where he'd find it. I knew he'd try to destroy it. Poirot smiled faintly. And so, he said, the second crime has failed. The arrest of Lionel Thane occurred with minimal resistance. After Geraldine's return and the presentation of her annotated book, he stopped struggling and simply went still, like a man who had been outrun by inevitability. Inspector Crome placed the handcuffs on with practiced indifference, but Poirot noticed the way Thane's eyes avoided every face in the room except one, Ambrose Venn. Even in disgrace, he had something to say, but not in words. Once Thane had been led out, the silence in La Plume d'Or returned heavier than before. Elodie Warburton broke it first, her voice flat. This will ruin us. Poirot turned to her. Your firm, our reputations, the clubs, the book, everything. She gestured vaguely toward Venn. You don't recover from a murder tied to your premier title, sales or not. Venn, still pale and speechless, said nothing. Poirot raised a hand. Mademoiselle, you concern yourself with the appearance of the matter, but the truth, it is better uncovered than concealed. This book, it will live on, yes, but not for its prose. For its connection to death. She stared at him. You say that like it's a good thing. Poirot merely inclined his head. Geraldine, still damp but composed, approached Poirot near the fireplace where the case had begun. She clutched the book to her chest like a shield. I was sure it was him, she said, but I wasn't sure I'd get away before he caught up to me. You were reckless, Poirot replied, but not foolish. I left the book in the storage room because I knew he'd try to find it. I waited outside in the alley until he went in. I watched through the staff window. Then I walked straight to the constables at the gate. You were clever enough to bait him, but lucky too. She nodded slowly. He was watching me. Since the breakfast, he suspected I knew. Poirot turned and paced to the mantel. He followed you as any poor writer follows formula. You gave him an ending, and he tried to write the conclusion with the same shallow thinking he used to stage the murder. She looked at him, suddenly uncertain. Why do you think he did it, really? Just jealousy? Career desperation? Poirot did not answer at once. He folded his arms, eyes fixed on the empty reading chair where Felix Garrison's body had been found just days earlier. No, he said softly. Jealousy was the surface. But it was something else, something more bitter. Thane did not merely envy Garrison's influence. He hated that Garrison had the power to erase, to destroy with a paragraph what others had labored years to create. Geraldine waited quietly as Poirot continued. He knew Garrison would eviscerate Venn's novel. And perhaps he believed the novel was brilliant. Perhaps he saw in it the kind of success he would never achieve. So he killed the critic who could kill the book, and framed the author in the process. Elodie had drifted closer during the conversation. But why stage it exactly like the novel? Poirot turned to her. Because if Venn's book had been destroyed in print, it would be forgotten. But if a murder mirrored its pages, it would become infamous. Immortal. Thane would be remembered, if not as a writer, then as the architect of the crime no one could stop discussing. Geraldine's voice grew quiet, and he would have gotten away with it if page 193 had never existed. Oui, Poirot said. But the smallest oversight, c'est tout. That is always the flaw in the design of murder. It is built for the immediate, not for the inevitable. Inspector Crome re-entered, giving a nod that the suspect was in custody. Poirot thanked him, then addressed the group still assembled. "The club may reopen if you choose," he said. "The worst has passed." Elodie gave a dry laugh. "You've never worked in publishing. This is only the beginning." She turned to Venn. "We'll have to pull the book. Delay launch. Rewrite the ending. Add a preface. Maybe cancel it entirely. Your name is tied to this for the rest of your life." Venn said nothing. His eyes were on the fire, as if he too were thinking of ashes. Geraldine touched his sleeve lightly. "You could write something else. Something new. Something clean." He looked at her with a faint, exhausted smile. "I wrote truth into fiction, and fiction became truth. I don't know if I can separate the two anymore." Poirot listened but did not interrupt. Instead, he walked slowly through the lounge toward the door. At the threshold, he turned one final time. "You see, messieurs and mesdames," he said, "the mind that commits murder often believes itself superior to consequence. But consequence, it arrives all the same. Not always in handcuffs, sometimes in silence, in shame, in knowing." He tapped the side of his temple. "There is no punishment more precise than the one we carry in here." He stepped out, leaving behind the club, the book, and the ghost of a scene that had been written, acted, and undone. But for the world beyond Chandler Street, the story had just begun. By evening, news of the murder and its bizarre literary connection exploded across London's cultural pages. The Crimson Folio sold out its limited first run within hours, despite, or because of, its associations. Bookstores began printing signs, as seen in the Garrison murder. Publishers scrambled to rethink campaigns while critics debated whether art had imitated life or the other way around. Elodie issued a tight-lipped statement. "Silverbell Publishing regrets the loss of a life and condemns the use of fiction as blueprint for violence." Ambrose Venn withdrew from the public eye. Rumors swirled of a breakdown. Geraldine Marsh declined interviews, but submitted an op-ed to the Times titled, "When Fiction Fails the Moral Test." And Lionel Thane, he sat in a grey cell, awaiting trial. His manuscript, A Kingdom of Scorn, would never see print, but a different legacy was already forming around his name. The critics he once loathed now dissected his real-life performance with relish. "Theatre critic turned killer," one headline read. "Failed novelist stages one final draft," said another. And yet, in quiet corners of literary cafes, one uncomfortable truth lingered. Lionel Thane had written a scene that people would never forget. It just happened to be written in blood. Though Lionel Thane's arrest had concluded the visible part of the case, Hercule Poirot knew better than to trust final acts that arrived too soon. He remained in London for several days following the events at La Plume d'Or, not to supervise legalities, that was Crome's domain, but to contemplate a detail that continued to gnaw at his highly organized sense of truth. A single thread, delicate yet persistent, remained untied. And to a mind such as Poirot's, such things were intolerable. It had surfaced during his inspection of the annotated copy of the Crimson Folio, the very one Garrison had made his infamous notes in, the same one Geraldine had cleverly used to bait Thane. As Poirot reviewed the notes one final time, a strange discrepancy caught his eye. The ink. Felix Garrison's notes had been assumed to be all his own, marked in a deep blue fountain pen consistent with others found in his briefcase. But nestled between those handwritten critiques was a different edition. A single phrase in lighter ink, smaller handwriting, and lacking Garrison's usual jagged style. It read simply, "Include mention of the ring, page 193. Poirot frowned and returned to the earlier pages, then flipped through the rest of the manuscript. The handwriting was not Garrison's. It was careful, slightly rounded with subtle flourishes. But there was more. That same handwriting had appeared in another context. The printer's receipt Geraldine Marsh had kept, where she'd ordered a copy of Chapter 11. The signature on the bottom corner of that receipt, though faint, matched this note in style and slope. Geraldine. He placed both papers side by side beneath the library's reading lamp, adjusting the light so the contrast in ink became more apparent. Garrison had not written that line. Geraldine had. Poirot leaned back in the club's quiet library and considered the implications. Geraldine Marsh had insisted she received the full manuscript, proofed it, in fact, and that she discovered the killer's error because he mimicked the book but forgot about the detail involving the ring. Yet now, evidence suggested she had inserted the reference to the ring herself after Garrison's death, which meant the ring wasn't originally in the text at all, and neither was page 193. It was a forgery. Poirot rose from his seat and returned to the front desk of the club. "I require use of the telephone at once," he told the steward. "A call to the printer in Soho, the one that handled a private order for Miss Geraldine Marsh." The printer's assistant confirmed that a young woman had indeed requested a private reprint of pages 190 to 193 from the Crimson Folio, but she had supplied the text herself, typed and formatted. The assistant had simply printed what he was given. No cross-checking, no questions. Poirot thanked him and hung up. In that moment, a cold certainty formed in his mind. Geraldine Marsh had planted the detail that exposed Thane, which meant she had known in advance that he would fall for it, which meant she had orchestrated the exposure, not as a witness, but as a writer. Poirot returned to his suite and summoned Inspector Crome. When the man arrived, notebook already open, Poirot wasted no time. "You arrested the wrong man," he said softly. Crome froze. "We have the book, the notes, the confession." "A confession built on a trap," Poirot interrupted, "and a trap built by someone who knew Lionel Thane's limitations better than he knew them himself." He handed Crome both pages, the manuscript and the printer's receipt. "Compare the handwriting." Crome studied them, his brow furrowed. "They match. This is Geraldine's." "Exactly. She inserted the ring. She planted the clue. She staged the reveal." Crome's voice dropped. "Are you saying she's the real killer?" Poirot exhaled, slow and deliberate. "No. I'm saying she's the author of the story." He paused. "Let us return to the motive." Crome sat down, brow furrowed. "We believed Thane staged the murder to mirror the book and frame Venn. But you're suggesting Geraldine staged the exposure to frame Thane." Poirot nodded. She knew Thane had the ego to think he could execute the crime perfectly if he copied the scene. She knew he'd follow what he heard during the manuscript reading, and no further. She also knew that if the scene was reconstructed but lacked a key detail, it would signal incomplete knowledge. So she wrote that detail herself, printed it, planted it, and lured him to find it. Crome frowned. "But that means she anticipated the murder before it happened." "No," Poirot said. "She did not anticipate. It was after. After Garrison was killed, she suspected Thane. She needed proof. So she created it." Crome stood. "Then it's still him. He still did it." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "Thane is guilty. But his guilt was not discovered through deduction. It was manufactured through fiction." He folded his hands. "You see the irony, mon ami? A crime inspired by a book, exposed by a page that was never written. Fiction gave birth to murder, and fiction uncovered it. But what does that mean legally?" Poirot shrugged. "The police will argue Thane confessed, that his attempt to destroy the planted book proves intent. But ethically," he shook his head, The line is less clear. Crome remained silent for a moment. What do we do with her? Nothing, Poirot said quietly. Unless you wish to tell the public that the killer was outwitted not by a detective, but by an editor with a flair for revision. He stood and walked to the window. No, let it be. Crome narrowed his eyes. You're sure? I am. The true ending has already been written. The killer is in custody, the motive exposed, but the justice... Poirot looked out across the city, grey and bright in equal measure. The justice came from someone who understood that sometimes truth alone cannot solve a crime. He turned back to the inspector. It must be persuaded. Late that afternoon, Hercule Poirot summoned the remaining principals back to La Plume d'Or's grand reading room, now cleared of forensic tapes and evidence markers, but still heavy with the memory of its original horror. The room's tall windows were open to forgive the stifling air of a London heat wave turning into evening sultriness. Sunlight and shadow danced over the polished floorboards. A single chair remained at the center of the room, a silent tribute to the chaise where Felix Garrison had first fallen. One by one, Ambrose Venn, Elodie Warburton, and Geraldine Marsh entered, each hesitating as they crossed the threshold. Inspector Crome stood to one side, notebook in hand, but entirely silent. Poirot himself took position beside the lone chair, his posture immaculate, his expression both gentle and commanding. "Mes amis," he began, voice soft but carrying. "We gather here not to persecute, but to understand. A crime was committed. We have seen its aftermath. We have witnessed the arrest of one man, but every drama requires an audience, and a final act to tie its threads." He turned first to Venn. "Monsieur Venn, you wrote the crime into your fiction. You created the words that described a man lying dead, a glass at his side, and a book clutched in his hand. When reality mirrored your imagination, suspicion naturally fell upon you. Yet, you did not kill Felix Garrison." Venn inclined his head, pale lips pressed together. Poirot shifted his gaze to Elodie Warburton. "Mademoiselle, you had your own vendetta against the critic. The deleted email, the fingerprints on the glass, these were true. You were angry, you hated the man, but hatred alone does not prove murder. You did not stab him. You are not the murderer." Elodie's posture relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained wary. He faced Geraldine Marsh last. "Mademoiselle Marsh, you discovered the killer's error. You proofread the manuscript. You noted the detail of the ring that was omitted in the staged murder. With courage, some might say recklessness, you planted that clue to expose your suspect, but you did not commit the crime." Geraldine swallowed visibly, her hands clenching at her sides. Poirot paused, then spoke toward the empty chair. Yet, someone did. Someone who heard that scene read aloud, memorized its staging, and believed he could reproduce it in perfect imitation. A man who trusted that fiction would protect him from suspicion, that the author of the novel would bear the blame. He took a step backward. Only one man fit that description. At that pronouncement, Lionel Thane's heavy footsteps echoed in the adjoining hall as he was escorted back into the room by two constables. His face was drawn, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but defiant. Poirot inclined his head in acknowledgement, then addressed Thane directly. "Monsieur Thane, you believed yourself clever. You thought that by replicating the murder as described in the novel, you could frame the author, Mr. Venn, and silence the critic who had destroyed your literary reputation. You armed yourself with knowledge you had overheard, but you did not know of the critic's own annotations. You did not know of the page that described the ring, a detail known only to one person in this room." Thane's eyes flickered toward Geraldine, guilt and panic mingling in his gaze. "You believed that in reproducing every element precisely, you would remain untraceable. Instead, you were undone by your incomplete knowledge. You followed what you heard, down to the glass of crème de cassis. but you fail to imagine that the critic himself would alter the scene. That detail became your undoing. He produced the battered copy of the Crimson Folio, the one from the basement, placing it gently on the chair. This book, with its torn page and Geraldine's carefully inserted margin note, was the lure. You could not resist discovering what she had found, and in your desperation, you attempted to destroy the evidence, thus sealing your own fate. Thane's shoulders sagged. Inspector Crome stepped forward. Lionel, Thane, you are hereby charged with the murder of Felix Garrison and with tampering with evidence. Do you understand the charges against you? Thane nodded, voice hoarse. I understand. Poirot responded, not with triumph, but with measured compassion. Monsieur Thane, this tragedy was born of envy and fear. There was another path, one of confession and perhaps redemption. Instead, you chose to write reality in the same ink as your fiction, and reality has proven far less forgiving. He turned back to the others. And now, the story concludes. Yet like any tale, it leaves echoes. Mr. Venn, you must decide if you will publish this work. Miss Warburton, your reputation may suffer, but your integrity is intact. And you, Miss Marsh, have shown that even in fiction, truth must prevail. A hush fell over the room, punctuated only by distant traffic. The final gathering had served its purpose, to unmask the villain, to reconcile the survivors, and to bring closure, or as much as closure a literary murder could offer. Poirot looked at each face in turn. Remember, mes amis, murder is the most dramatic of crimes, but its consequences are not a performance. They are lived in sorrow and regret. May you all find peace in your chapters ahead. He straightened his tie and gestured quietly to Crome. The inspector nodded, and the constables moved to lead Thane away. Poirot lingered a moment longer, touching the spines of the empty chairs. Then, with a final nod, he turned and left the room, leaving behind a circle of individuals forever altered by fiction's darkest mimicry. The courthouse in the Strand was bathed in late morning light when Lionel Thane's trial commenced. The press had camped beneath its portico for days, eager for any sensational detail from a case that had blurred the line between fiction and reality. Inside the marble halls, Poirot and Inspector Crome took seats in the gallery just behind a cluster of journalists. The accused man sat alone at the defendant's table, his once proud posture now slumped, his eyes hollow with the knowledge that the story he had tried to write for himself had turned into a tragedy he could never edit. The prosecution opened with a crisp summary of the evidence. Thane's presence at La Plume d'Or, the correspondence threatening Venn's novel, the glass bearing his fingerprints, and above all, the torn page from the Crimson Folio, the planted clue that had lured him into exposing himself. Witnesses testified to his anger toward Garrison's criticisms and to his furtive movements on the day of the murder. The Crown painted a portrait of a man consumed by envy, who believed that a perfectly staged crime could vindicate his wounded ego. When the defense rose, it was clear they faced an uphill battle. Their argument acknowledged Thane's resentment, but suggested that someone else had manipulated the evidence to frame him. They implied that Geraldine Marsh's involvement might have obscured the truth, and that the true killer remained at large. But the judge interrupted immediately, ruling that the defense had no admissible proof to contradict the extensive physical and testimonial evidence. The judge's stern rebuke left the defense counsel struggling to regain credibility. Throughout the proceedings, Thane did not testify. He gazed at the floor, occasionally staring at the jury box as though hoping for mercy in their faces. In the gallery, Geraldine sat stiffly beside Elodie and Ambrose. None spoke. Their presence was a silent testament to the personal toll of the drama. Even Crome, usually impervious to sentiment, looked away when a well-known critic of the Times opined aloud. A writer's final performance, children in a genre he could not master. By mid-afternoon, closing arguments neared. The prosecutor paced before the jury, voice measured yet forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Mr. Thane attempted to use literature as a weapon. He believed that by mimicking a fictional crime, he could write himself into innocence. But true men of letters know that words carry weight in both page and world. He is guilty of murder and of abusing the trust we place in narrative." He sat, and the courtroom fell silent as the defense counsel delivered a brief, somber plea for mercy, citing Thane's remorse and lack of premeditated violence beyond manipulation. The jury retired. In the hush that followed, Poirot observed each face in the courtroom: Ambrose's pale determination, Elodie's brittle composure, Geraldine's quiet relief tempered by sorrow. He leaned toward Crome. "Justice in this case will not undo the harm done, but it will remind the world that truth matters beyond artistry." Crome nodded but said nothing. An hour later, the jury returned. The foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lionel Thane, guilty as charged." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Thane's shoulders dropped, and his chin trembled as the words echoed. The judge pronounced the sentence: life imprisonment, with a minimum term to be served before consideration of parole. A judgment that matched the gravity of a crime committed with such calculated cruelty. Outside, the press stampede was immediate. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Elodie emerged first, flanked by her legal team. She spoke with practiced poise. "We respect the court's decision. No sentence can restore a life lost, but we trust in the system's fairness." She departed quickly, vanishing into waiting cars. Venn followed, offering a brief statement. Ambrose Venn remains dedicated to his work. He hopes this will never be repeated in art or life. His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. Geraldine remained inside until the crowd dispersed. When she finally stepped onto the steps, she looked toward the Thames as if seeking a private moment in public space. Poirot watched silently. Then he approached Geraldine. "You did well," he said quietly. "Without your insight, the wrong man might have been bound over us all." She blinked back tears. "I only wanted the truth," she replied. "I did not know how dangerous that could be." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "the truth is the only justice that lasts beyond the courtroom. Evidence can convict, but only truth can heal." He offered an arm, and she accepted. Together they walked into the daylight, leaving behind the stone halls and the clamor of headlines. In the weeks that followed, the literary world reeled from the scandal. The Crimson Folio became legendary, not for its artistry, but for its role in a real-life murder. Critics debated the ethics of art imitating life. Academics published papers on the psychology of reenactment. Book clubs met to discuss whether the book should ever be read again. Venn's publisher quietly ceased further printings, and the manuscript was withdrawn indefinitely. Ambrose Venn retreated to his country estate in Sussex, where he began work on a new novel, one that refused to reference crime too closely. He sought solace in nature and the rhythms of daily life, hoping to distance the act of creation from the shadow of violence. Elodie resumed her editorial duties, but focused on new voices, seeking to champion authors who wrote of empathy rather than vengeance. Geraldine returned to her role as a proofreader and editor, her reputation enhanced by her role in solving the case. Yet she carried a weight long after the trial ended. She began writing her own essays on ethics in publishing, exploring how words can wield power for good or ill. Her voice became respected in literary circles for its moral clarity. As for Hercule Poirot, he slipped quietly back to his flat in Duke Street. There, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He polished his mustache before the mirror, then poured a small glass of brandy. He thought of the victims: Felix Garrison, whose life ended in vengeance; Lionel Thane, whose talent unraveled in tragedy; Geraldine Marsh, whose courage saved justice, and he considered his own role, not as an enforcer of law, but as a custodian of truth. He wrote a letter to Inspector Crome, commending his dedication and gently advising him to take time away from the intensity of high-profile cases. Then he penned a brief note to Geraldine, urging her to continue her work with integrity and to remember that sometimes the most powerful stories are those that uphold the truth rather than obscure it. Finally, Poirot set aside his pen and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page he wrote, "In books we may read of crime, in newspapers we may see its consequences, but in each mind we must find the line where narrative ends and reality begins." He closed the notebook with a satisfied click and stood by the window, gazing out at the London skyline. A carriage rattled by in the street below, the city's pulse unbroken. Monsieur Poirot smiled to himself. The case was closed, the wrongs addressed, and the fragile boundary between fiction and life restored. For now. And as night fell, he knew that his little grey cells would rest well, dreaming not of murder plots, but of justice fulfilled and the eternal pursuit of truth. The late afternoon sun had waned to a gentle amber by the time Hercule Poirot slipped out of La Plume d'Or for the final time. The club's polished doors closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty lobby, as though the very walls sighed in relief at the conclusion of so tangled a drama. Outside, the London streets were beginning to bustle with evening traffic, omnibuses clattering on cobblestones, hansom cabs rattling along the gutters, pedestrians hurrying with lanterns and umbrellas to ward off the promise of rain. Yet Poirot strolled with unhurried steps, adjusting his bowler hat and straightening his immaculate grey overcoat as though the case he had just closed belonged to a different world altogether. He paused beneath a lamp post that was not yet lit and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. For the first time since Felix Garrison's murder, the detective permitted his thoughts to roam beyond the immediate clues and red herrings. He thought of the critic whose pen had spoken so loudly that it drew a blade, of the novelist whose envy had driven him to recreate a fictional death, of the editor whose own anger had nearly ensnared her in the net of suspicion, and of the young proofreader whose courage and ingenuity had turned the tide of justice. Each had played a role in this tragic pageant, bound together by words that became deeds and deeds that became legend. Poirot's keen eyes drifted upward to the darkening sky, where storm clouds gathered in roiling clusters. He remembered the first time he had viewed the crimson folio, quelled by its chilling precision, how he had sensed from that moment that art and life were dangerously intertwined. He recalled the thrill of unmasking the murderer and the deeper satisfaction of uncovering the hidden architect who exposed him. Yet above all, he felt the weight of the unanswered question that always lingered after a case. How fragile the boundary between imagination and reality truly is, and how often human pride fails to recognize its own vulnerability. A soft breeze stirred the hem of his coat, and he turned to face the entrance of the club one last time. The sign above the door gleamed faintly in the dull light. La Plume d'Or. A fitting name, he mused, for a place where the golden pen had wielded both creation and destruction. He tapped the side of his head, where his little grey cells lay in eternal vigil. "It is curious," he murmured in his gentle Belgian accent, "that we cherish stories for their beauty and suspense, yet we fear their power when they step off the page." Poirot resumed his walk along the pavement, each step measured, each moment savored. He passed a newsstand adorned with headlines proclaiming "Murder in Mayfair Mimics Novel" and "Critic's Death Echoes Fiction." His heart stirred with a quiet approval. Though the tale had exacted a heavy toll, it would endure in print, an enduring cautionary tale for readers and writers alike. But he also understood that headlines fade, and that the true legacy of a crime is written in human lives rather than newspaper columns. He thought, too, of the ring the small, cracked stone that had never existed in Ven's original text, but whose absence became the key to revelation. The ring caught in his mind like a diamond left unpolished, a reminder that the smallest detail holds the greatest significance. In that moment, Poirot considered the broader lesson. In both fiction and life, it is often the overlooked fragment, the footnote, the margin note, the torn page that betrays the entire design. As the lampost's glow flickered to life, he passed beneath its light and observed a young couple reading aloud from a battered paperback copy of The Crimson Folio, their faces illuminated by intrigue and admiration. They did not know the story behind the story, or that the book they held would never be reprinted officially. They only cared for the mystery and the sense of wonder it evoked. Poirot smiled to himself. "Ah, the innocence of readers," he said softly. "They seek only entertainment, seldom pondering the true cost of the ink upon the page." He turned the corner and made his way toward the Thames embankment, where the water gleamed like liquid obsidian under the first stars. The river's steady flow reminded him that time moves ever onward, indifferent to the stirrings of human drama. He paused at the edge of the embankment railing and leaned forward to listen to the ripple of water against stone. In that tranquil moment, the world seemed vast and unfathomable, a tapestry of stories, each one interlaced with countless others in patterns too complex for any single mind to unravel. Poirot took from his coat pocket a small notebook, the same one in which he had penned his final musings on truth and narrative. He read, in his neat script, the words he had written. "In books we may read of crime, in newspapers we may see its consequences, but in each mind we must find the line where narrative ends and reality begins." He closed the notebook with a firm tap and replaced it safely in his pocket. That line, once theoretical, had become all too real in the lives he had touched and in the blood that had stained those pristine pages. A distant church bell tolled the hour of 9, and Poirot straightened. "It is time," he said to the night air, as though addressing an unseen interlocutor. "Time to leave this drama behind and return to quieter pursuits." He thought of his flat in Duke Street, where a steaming plate of sole meunière awaited, and where familiar comforts dispelled the echoes of recent horrors. Yet even as he anticipated home, he felt the enduring pull of the unfinished question that every case leaves in its wake. Pausing at a carriage stand, he climbed into the back seat of a waiting hansom cab and settled among his neatly arranged belongings. The driver cracked his whip, and the cab rolled forward, its horse's hooves clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting out the final beats of the day. Poirot gazed out the window as the city drifted past, the gas lamps reflected in puddles, shop windows darkening for the night, solitary lamplighters ascending ladders to ignite the last lamps in a golden constellation. Before long, the cab rattled to a halt outside his apartment. Poirot alighted and handed the fare to the driver, his composure unfazed. He paused on the doorstep, inhaled the chill of the evening air, and gathered his cane and hat. "Au revoir, London," he whispered. "May you continue to weave stories that entertain but never transgress the fragile line between imagination and life." He ascended the steps and entered the building's dimly lit foyer, where the concierge tipped his hat in silent greeting. Inside his flat, Poirot removed his coat and hat with practiced grace and retrieved the letter he had written to Inspector Crome. He placed it on his writing desk beside a fresh sheet of stationery addressed to Geraldine Marsh. In the gentle lamplight, he penned a final note beneath the signatures, adding a single line, "May your own narrative always honor the truth, for it is the greatest story of all." He folded the letters and sealed them with a flourish of wax. At last, Poirot crossed to his small sitting room, where the brandy glass still stood half full on the side table. He poured the remainder into his mouth, savoring the warmth as it traveled down his throat. Then he settled into his favorite armchair, hands folded neatly in his lap, and allowed his eyes to close. The day's events drifted away as he surrendered to the peace of the night. And in that moment of quiet repose, Hercule Poirot, detective, philosopher, and custodian of justice, smiled once more, knowing that his little grey cells had once again upheld the fragile boundary between the world of fiction and the reality of human consequence. For now, the story was complete, the final chapter written. Yet, as always, a question lingered beneath the surface, waiting for another case, another clue, another twist in the endless narrative of life itself. Several months later, autumn's first chill had begun to bite at the London air, and the streets were strewn with fallen copper and gold leaves. In a quiet corner of Belgravia, the venerable library of the Athenaeum Club remained hushed beneath its lofty cupolas. Yet inside one small alcove, a curious congregation gathered each Tuesday evening. Around a polished oak table, a handful of bibliophiles, some drawn by true love of literature, others by the notoriety of one infamous volume, met to discuss the Crimson Folio. Though the novel itself had never returned to print, its legend lived on in whispered anecdotes and private readings of carefully circulated copies. Hercule Poirot, now firmly returned to his routine, made a rare appearance among them. He arrived not to preside, but to listen. Clad in a dark overcoat and bowler hat, he took his place at the back of the room, where he observed the animated discourse with keen interest. One member spoke of the novel's chilling opening lines. Another dwelled on the moral ambiguity of fiction that seems to forecast real events. Across the room, an elderly gentleman recited a passage in a trembling voice, an imitation of the scene that once ushered a man into death. Poirot allowed himself a faint, indulgent smile. He remembered the first time he had read those lines and the cold thrill of recognizing tragic potential behind elegant prose. Yet here, surrounded by readers who regarded the text purely as art, he detected no fear, only wonder. It was a comforting sight that after so much darkness, people could still find beauty in words once stained with violence. When the gathering concluded, Poirot rose and approached the head of the table, where the group's impromptu secretary closed his well-worn notebook. With a modest bow, Poirot offered a few observations of his own, succinct and insightful, reflecting on the delicate balance between author, reader, and reality. His remarks were received with bowed heads and grateful smiles, and when the meeting broke, several members lingered to thank him personally, as though honored by proximity to the detective who had untangled fact from fiction. Outside, the night air was crisper, and gas lamps glowed softly along the pavement. Poirot paused at a newsstand, where a single copy of the Literary Review lay open on its rack. The magazine's cover featured an essay titled "When Words Turn to Weapons: The Lasting Impact of the Crimson Folio." Under the lights, headlines proclaimed that universities had proposed courses examining the relationship between narrative and violence, using the folio as a case study. Poirot observed a young student leafing through the pages with rapt attention, another incarnation of the text's enduring power. He continued on toward his flat, reflecting on how a single story could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Felix Garrison's death had initially thrust the novel into infamy, but subsequent scholarship had reframed the book as a cautionary parable about the responsibility borne by both writer and reader. Poets and philosophers debated whether a narrative could plant ideas like seeds in the mind, sprouting actions long after the ink had dried. Poirot himself often mused on the moral dimension of storytelling, and in recent weeks he had received letters from journalists and scholars seeking his perspective on these weighty questions. In his apartment on Duke Street, Poirot found a small parcel neatly tied with twine on his writing desk. Inside was a freshly printed pamphlet entitled "Annotations on the Crimson Folio: Ethical Considerations for Modern Writers," authored by none other than Geraldine Marsh. She had taken her experience beyond mere commentary, crafting a thoughtful exploration of how editors, critics, and proofreaders share collective responsibility for the stories they shepherd. Poirot read her introduction by lamplight, admiring the clarity and compassion of her prose. At the end of the pamphlet, she had inscribed, "To the detective who taught me that truth must be practiced with as much care as fiction." Poirot pressed his fingertips to the ink and felt a warm sense of affirmation. The impact of her actions had been profound, and she had transformed her ordeal into a force for good. Later, as autumn deepened into winter, Poirot received an unexpected invitation from Ambrose Venn himself. The reclusive author, now recovering at his Sussex estate, invited Poirot to visit and discuss a new manuscript he was contemplating, one that would explore themes of redemption rather than retribution. Though Poirot hesitated at first, unaccustomed to mixing with the artistic world outside of crime, he accepted. He recognized that Venn, having witnessed how fiction could bleed into reality with lethal effect, sought guidance on crafting a narrative that would heal rather than harm. Poirot looked forward to advising the author on how to balance suspense with moral responsibility, ensuring that the next tale would inspire empathy rather than envy. By Christmas, the story of the Crimson Folio had permeated popular culture. A radio program dramatized the novel's plot, minus any reference to real-world events, and audiences listened in fascination. Book clubs across England debated whether the novel ought to be included in school curriculums, and professional writers' guilds issued guidelines on ethical writing practices, citing the case as a landmark. Critics who had once dismissed such measures as excessive now acknowledged the thin line separating abstract ideas from human action. Even in Paris and New York, scholars wrote about the folio effect, coining the term to describe narratives that appear to influence reality. Through it all, Poirot maintained his characteristic discretion. He granted only one interview, an essay for a literary journal, in which he emphasized that he was neither moralist nor censor, but simply a detective committed to uncovering truth. He wrote, "Stories are not inherently dangerous, but we must never forget that in the right or wrong hands, they can shape destinies." His words were widely reprinted, becoming a touchstone for discussions on the ethics of storytelling. On New Year's Eve, Poirot attended a small gathering at the home of Inspector Crome, who had taken a leave from the yard to pen his own memoirs. Amid steaming cups of tea and mince pies, Poirot listened as Crome recounted anecdotes from their shared cases. When midnight chimed, they stepped out onto the terrace to watch fireworks burst over the Thames. Poirot, ever the philosopher, remarked that each explosion of light reminded him of ideas sparked in the human mind, some gentle, others explosive, and as the last rockets faded, he quietly toasted the hope that stories would light the way, rather than set fire to life itself. Upon returning home, Poirot settled into his armchair before the hearth, the brandy he favored on special occasions warming his hand. He reflected on the past year's events, the case that had begun with a chilling prediction in ink and ended with a broader understanding of narrative's power. The little grey cells that so often guided him had now witnessed not only murder and deceit, but redemption and renewal. In the soft glow of the fire, he closed his eyes and allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. He reached for his notebook and wrote a final entry under the heading, Epilogue. A novel is a mirror held up to humanity. When cracks appear, we must mend them with truth, compassion, and caution. Only then can our stories stand the test of time without shattering the world that reads them. With that, Poirot placed his pen aside, leaned back, and listened to the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Proof that some stories, once concluded, leave not chaos behind, but a quieter harmony in which justice and integrity endure. Hercule Poirot stood once more in the grand reading room of La Plume d'Or, the very space where fiction and reality had collided in deadly fashion. The afternoon light filtered through high windows, casting long patterns upon the polished floorboards and illuminating the single chair at the room's center, as though it were an altar. Today, the room was restored to order. No forensic markers, no police tapes. Yet an electric tension still hummed in the air, as though the echoes of the crime had settled into its walls. Monsieur Poirot, impeccably dressed in his grey suit and bowler hat, surveyed the assembled company with his characteristic calm precision. Before him stood Ambrose Venn, once crushed by suspicion, Elodie Warburton, whose anger nearly ensnared her, Geraldine Marsh, whose courage had guided justice, and Inspector Crome, ever the embodiment of law and order. From the adjoining hallway stepped Lionel Thane, now out of formal custody for this final moment, escorted by 2 plainclothes constables who had been granted leave to attend. Both trial and truth demanded it. Poirot raised a gloved hand for silence. Mes amis, we are gathered here not to repunish nor to humble, but to bring our drama to its final act. A story that began with a book predicting murder must conclude with the revelation of its author. Not of fiction, but of fact. He paused, eyes sweeping each face. First, let me thank you, all. Monsieur Venn, you summoned me to your club. Elodie, you bore the inspector's scrutiny. Geraldine, you risked your safety. And Inspector Crome, you upheld the law with diligence. Your cooperation has been exemplary. He turned to Thane. And you, monsieur, are the man whose envy drove him to enact a death he believed scripted by another's pen. You believed that by replicating a fictional scene you could evade suspicion, yet you overlooked the one detail that existed only in the critic's own mind and later in an editor's margin. The ring. You copied what you heard, but not what you did not hear. Thane's shoulders slumped. He did not contest Poirot's words. His eyes bore the resignation of one who knows the truth. Poirot continued, softer now. There is, however, one final piece to this puzzle, the motive deeper than envy. I spoke earlier of a wound beyond criticism, but what truly broke you, monsieur, was the fear that your own voice would be lost forever. He lifted a letter from his coat pocket, Lionel Thane's unpublished manuscript, recovered from a locked drawer. This, Poirot said, placing it on the chair, is your final draft, A Kingdom of Scorn. In its pages, I found not only satire, but a cry for recognition. You did not wish to kill the man. You wished to vanquish his power over your reputation. But in seeking validation through murder, you sacrificed the very thing you longed for, the legacy of your words. Thane looked upon his manuscript, trembling. I wanted to be heard. Poirot inclined his head. And now you will be heard, but as a footnote in tragedy rather than in literature. Let that serve as caution. The search for fame, when tainted by vengeance, can lead only to infamy. He turned back to the assembled party. Yet we do not close this chapter with despair. Monsieur Venn, your next work need not linger on death. Draw instead upon the resilience you found here. Mademoiselle Warburton, temper your critiques with compassion, for words carry unseen weight. And you, Miss Marsh, let your voice as essayist guide others toward ethical storytelling. Poirot paused at the threshold of the chair, gazing at the empty seat where Garrison had fallen. In the hush, one could almost sense the critic's presence, his pen forever stilled. Felix Garrison is gone, Poirot said softly. But his story and this terrible episode remind us that the boundary between narrative and action is perilously thin. We must tread carefully, lest we become characters in our own undoing. He stepped back and raised his cane. And so, with this final gathering, the curtain falls on the book that predicted the crime, but its legacy endures as both warning and wonder. Remember, mes amis, it is not the page that kills, but the hand that wields the pen. Turning to leave, Poirot paused at the door and addressed the silent room one last time. And now I pose to you a question worthy of reflection. If stories can inspire deeds both noble and dreadful, what tales shall we choose to live by? With that, he departed, his footsteps echoing softly down the corridor. Behind him, the company stood in solemn contemplation, each touched by the detective's parting provocation. As the door closed, the room seemed to exhale, the final mystery resolved, yet leaving open the greater puzzle of human hearts and human choices. Outside, London's bustle resumed. Omnibuses on cobblestones, voices hurrying past cafes, and the distant murmur of life unpaused. But within each mind that had witnessed Poirot's ultimate reveal, a new narrative had begun, one where the power of story was measured not in headlines, but in the conscience of those who read and those who write. And in that quiet triumph, justice and reflection walked hand in hand into the evening light.